Right, hi everybody, welcome back again. Let's move on with topic 2, and today I want to begin topic 2.2, which is called communities and ecosystems. When I went through the syllabus for this part to refresh my memory, what was obvious to me is there's 3 kind of subsections. So I thought it made sense to split this up into 3 separate videos, hopefully short ones. The first thing we look at, as you can see here, is energy flow through ecosystems. The second one I'll do next will be on food webs, food chains, and ecological pyramids. Ecological pyramids and food webs actually are, you could just say, are graphical representations of the movement of energy through an ecosystem. And then thirdly, we'll look at the movement of toxins and movement of pollutants through a food chain or through a food web. But obviously in this one we'll look specifically at the movement of energy, and I came up with 4 kind of key terms, as you can see again above my head. We'll begin by talking about respiration, then photosynthesis. We'll touch on something called chemosynthesis, which technically isn't really mentioned on the syllabus, but I think it's worth having some knowledge about. And then kind of the thing that links all these things together, maybe more so actually ecological pyramids and food chains, is we'll go back to what we talked about in topic 1 about the laws of thermodynamics, specifically the second law of thermodynamics. So again, if that's something you're a little bit unsure of, it might be worth going back to topic 1 again before you move on with this. Okay, let me show you the syllabus. I won't waste your time reading through it again word for word. But what I would say here is we can basically split this up into kind of subsections again. First of all, we'll talk about respiration. Then we'll talk about photosynthesis, the mechanics of those processes. And then again, like I said before, we'll link it all together by just referring fairly briefly, I think, to the laws of thermodynamics. I think perhaps what is more interesting here is these references to applications and skills. You need to be able to explain the transfer and transformation of energy through an ecosystem. Some of this again refers to what we'll do in the next video about food webs and ecological pyramids. We need to think a little bit about the efficiency, or perhaps you could say lack of efficiency, of energy transfers through systems. Again, that also applies to the second video that I'll do. In the classroom, we'll look at how we construct systems diagrams to represent photosynthesis and respiration. And here and again in the classroom, we'll talk a little bit about the laws of thermodynamics. More specifically, actually, the second law of thermodynamics, which refers to increases in entropy, or increases in disorder, or an increase in the lack of usefulness of energy that's available, you could say. Okay. Now, again, if you paused the syllabus and you looked carefully at what it actually said, which I'd encourage you to do, you might notice that you don't actually need these chemical formulas or the chemical equations for photosynthesis and respiration, but I've included them here just to make it a bit more obvious for those of you that are possibly more chemistry orientated. What the syllabus actually says is we need to be able to represent them as word equations. So I will write in the words here. So here we've got, for photosynthesis, we begin with the raw materials of carbon dioxide and water. And we produce glucose, organic food source, and the waste product, if you can call it a waste product, of oxygen. This process uses sunlight as an energy source to allow that to happen. Okay. Secondly, we look at respiration. It's almost the reverse. We begin with the product that photosynthesis produces, which is glucose. It's combined with oxygen. You could say it's oxidized, and the waste products here are carbon dioxide and water. I'm afraid I will ask you to try to memorize not necessarily the chemical formulae, but try to memorize the word equations for that, please. That's the process of photosynthesis and respiration in terms of matter. Okay, and now if we consider this in terms of a system, we can consider photosynthesis and respiration to be processes that occur within a system, or we could say within an ecosystem. We therefore, for each of those equations, we have inputs, outputs, transformations, and the overall process. Like I said on the previous slide, the inputs of photosynthesis are, in terms of matter, water and carbon dioxide, and light energy is used. And in terms of inputs for respiration, it's glucose and oxygen. Outputs for photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, and outputs for respiration, water, carbon dioxide, and heat energy this time. So you can see, I think it's a bit more clear in this table, how photosynthesis and respiration can be considered almost the reverse of each other. Transformations I've already mentioned. And this is the process. Photosynthesis, chlorophyll traps light energy. The energy is used to split water molecules. Hydrogen from water is combined with carbon dioxide and glucose is produced. In respiration, oxidation reactions inside cells break down glucose and therefore release heat energy. You can think at this point about how these energy transformations are linked to the laws of thermodynamics. For photosynthesis, energy is taken in from sunlight, and in respiration, heat energy is given out. When we convert useful energy like light into less useful energy like heat, what we're doing is we're increasing entropy. So therefore, the entropy of an ecosystem will increase over time. What prevents that increase in entropy becoming problematic is the constant influx of new light energy from the sun. Hope that made sense. Yeah. Okay, in this slide, I'd just like to touch very briefly on, like I said, a process that's not necessarily referred to in the syllabus itself, but it's quite useful to know about. Until the 1970s, all biologists really believed or thought that all life on Earth depended on photosynthesis. No ecosystem had ever been discovered where the producers did not produce their food using the process of photosynthesis. Until 1977, scientists from Woods Hole Institute went down to some of the deepest depths of the oceans to look at hydrothermal vents, or places where heat and other materials were coming up from the ocean floor through volcanic activity. And in one of the most amazing biological discoveries, certainly in the last few hundred years, they did actually find communities that didn't depend on photosynthesis. And the reason was they were so deep that light just didn't penetrate to those depths. The photographs you can see here are obviously all made possible from the artificial lights from the submersible. So hydrothermal vents are not based on photosynthetic activity, they're based on chemosynthetic activity or chemosynthesis. Basically, plants and algae use photosynthesis, and some bacteria use chemosynthesis. In chemosynthesis, instead of using light energy, energy is actually obtained to make organic food from the bonds in certain chemicals like hydrogen sulfides. So therefore, the production of the food by the producers is not dependent on sunlight. Interestingly, looking back to what we talked about in the previous video, a lot of these chemosynthetic bacteria live in mutualistic relationships with animals, specifically tube worms. I'm not going to go into the details because I think I can leave you to do your own research on that. And as I said, it's not technically on the syllabus. But it's just a really interesting biological discovery that might be of use in some essay questions, I would think. Okay, so again, looking back towards energy use and the laws of thermodynamics, we need to consider a little bit the efficiency of these processes, or the efficiency of photosynthesis. And when you think about it, when you do the mathematics, photosynthesis is an extremely inefficient process. First of all, only about half of the sun's total radiation that it releases is visible light. I think it's actually closer to about 44% of the energy that's released by the sun is visible light. And photosynthesis can only use certain wavelengths of visible light. So there's two ways there in which photosynthesis is not very efficient. One, it doesn't use all of the radiation available from the sun. And two, even then, it only uses certain wavelengths of visible light. It doesn't use green wavelengths, by the way, obviously, and that's the reason why photosynthetic organisms are green, because the green light is actually reflected and not absorbed. The producers use very little of the visible light available. As I said, only about 0.06% of the energy that they could actually use. And as I've said here, the remainder is actually reflected, transmitted, or is not used because it's not a correct wavelength that chlorophyll can use for photosynthesis. What that means is that plants especially are only about 0.1 to 2% efficient in terms of the energy use in order to make glucose in photosynthesis. Very inefficient. I'm not going to tell you why, I'm going to leave you the question, and I'm going to ask you, why do you think evolution has not driven photosynthetic organisms to become much more efficient? You might think that there would be a driving force to make photosynthesis over millions and millions or billions of years of evolution more and more efficient. Certainly more efficient than 2%. Okay, and then finally, the producers make energy available to consumers. We've already talked about feeding relationships. And the starting point of that is the glucose that the producers make. Energy is lost as this food goes through each trophic level by respiration and defecation, largely. What that means is about only 10% of the energy available in a trophic level is actually passed to the next trophic level. Again, you could argue that feeding relationships are, again, extremely inefficient. You might want to tell me why that is. And eventually, therefore, all of the initial energy that was captured by producers is lost. And it also means, I'll talk about this in the next video actually, it also means that trophic levels only go up to usually the 5th trophic level. To go to a 6th trophic level would there'll be so little energy left that it wouldn't be able to support a 6th trophic level. Okay, and I'm going to leave you a question based on that. Do you see the relevance of the second law of thermodynamics based on what I've just said there? Remember, the second law of thermodynamics relates to increasing entropy. Okay, I hope that was useful, everybody. So I've just covered the energy flow through ecosystems, and I think it will be complemented very much in the next video that I do, which is about feeding relationships. This final slide was an introduction to that idea. Okay, take care, everybody, and I will speak to you in the class this week.